Hi everyone, I'm Mark Duiker, developer advocate at Diagrid. In this video, we're taking a look at the Dapr 1.11 release highlights. 1.11 came out a couple of weeks ago, and then I published this blog post to cover the highlights. So let's see what are the new features and improvements in this release. Let's have a look at the APIs first. So first is the announcement that the Configuration API is now stable. You can use the Configuration API to retrieve configuration key value pairs from a configuration store. And what your application can also do is your application can subscribe to changes in this configuration store. So if a key value pair changes in the configuration store, your application can get a notification and use the latest configuration value. Here is the API that you can use to retrieve a configuration value. So this is the HTTP API here. You use the configuration endpoint. You use the store name, the configuration store name, and then you provide the key of the configuration key value. If you want to subscribe to the changes of the key value in the configuration store, you can use again the configuration API, the store name again, and then use the subscribe endpoint. A brand new API is the service invocation for non-Dapr endpoints. This is really a great improvement because now you can invoke endpoints which do not use Dapr. So maybe you're using older services which are built before you were using Dapr, or maybe you're like invoking endpoints of a complete third party, but you can still use the benefits of Dapr. So for instance, you can use the same resiliency policies, you can still do like scoped access control and use header authentications and so on. You can invoke these external endpoints in two ways. Either you can use an HTTP endpoint resource type. So then the API looks like this. You use the invoke API and you mention the name here of the HTTP endpoint resource. That's shown here underneath. We'll get to that in a second. And then you do /method and then you mention the actual method name that you want to invoke. Now, this needs a resource definition of type HTTP endpoint. And in the metadata, you give it a name and then you use this name in the URL here. The minimum information that you need is the base URL. And optionally, you can also provide like headers and use secrets in there, scope the access and use authentication. If you don't want to use this HTTP endpoint resource type, then you can also use the fully qualified name in the endpoint as well. So then you just replace that HTTP endpoint resource name with the fully qualified domain name in here. A very big update was done to workflow. So as you can see here in the logo, you can now also author workflows using Python. And in addition to that, there are some additional management APIs that you can use now to manage your workflow. If I just scroll down a bit, starting an API has changed slightly. So instead of instance ID /start, the instance ID is now optional. So you do /start and then you can provide the instance ID. If you don't provide one, the runtime will create one for you. And the other APIs are now terminate to stop a workflow. You can also briefly pause a workflow and then resume it. You can also purge the status of a workflow. So that's very useful if the workflow has been completed, but you don't need access anymore to that workflow state. Then you can get rid of that state because otherwise you will collect a lot of data, which you probably won't use anymore. So it's an important cleanup step. The last one, raise event, allows you to raise an event and your workflow can then wait until that event has been raised and accepted. So this allows you to create completely new types of applications, also referred to as like human interaction patterns. An example could be like you have a kind of an approval workflow where a manager needs to approve something. So your application or your workflow can then wait until that approval event has been received, and then the orchestration will continue. Another new API is the Cryptography API. This API allows you to easily and reliably encrypt and decrypt values in your application without exposing any secret information in your application, because Dapr will take care of that. This new API works with a couple of new components, and I'll mention them in the component section. The API looks like this. In this case, we have a JavaScript example. So we're using the Dapr client here, and then using the crypto.encrypt method, which accepts a plain text of the information that we want to encrypt. We then refer to a component name to specify the component resource, which contains the information on the encryption. And we specify a encryption key and an encryption algorithm. So that's encryption, and then the decryption is as follows. We again use the Dapr API, then we use the decrypt method. We mention the ciphertext that we want decrypted, and we specify the component name. All right, so those were the highlights of the APIs. Now let's have a look at the components. So there are a couple of new components. So for instance, there's a new WASM component that allows you to invoke applications which are compiled to WebAssembly. There is another component, another binding for Kytex. So you can invoke generic calls in Kytex. And Kytex is a Golang RPC framework. Then there's a new state store component, etcd, probably well known if you're using Kubernetes. Then there are a couple of cryptography components to work with the new Cryptography API. So you can use Azure Key Vault, you can use like a local storage, like a local file. You can use JSON web key sets, and you can use Kubernetes secrets. Then there are some component improvements. So this is the general lifecycle of components. So when they're first introduced, they are in alpha stage, then they move to beta, and then they are finally stable. If you want more information about that, definitely have a look at this certification lifecycle link, which points to the Dapr docs. So there are quite some components which move to stable. For instance, there's the AWS S3 binding. There are two middleware components, the rate limit one and the OpenID Connect move to stable. The GCP PubStub move to stable. Two state stores, GCP Firestore and SQLite move to stable. And then two configuration stores, PostgreSQL and Redis both move to stable. In addition, there were some improvements related to Azure components. So Azure AD authentication has been added to the Azure Storage Queues binding and the SQL Server State Store. And all components that support Azure AD now support authentication using Azure AD Workload Identity and Azure CLI credentials. If you want to have more information on the release, definitely have a look at the official Dapr 1.11 announcement that contains all of the info. In addition, if you want to try some stuff out, have a look at the Dapr Quick Starts. And last but not least, if you're looking for more information about Dapr or have some specific questions, please join the Dapr Discord. There are thousands of members there who can help you. Until next time.